As we expanded upon in our previous video of the series, the French B1 Bis tank was a very peculiar design, one which, on paper, appeared to be one of the strongest tanks of the 1930s, but which featured a number of sometimes superficial, sometimes critical flaws which would end up vastly hampering its use in operations, which is what we are going to see now, the B1 Bis's use in combat during the Campaign of France and beyond. In operations, the B1 Bis were all to be grouped within the French infantry's armored divisions, the Division Cuirassée de Réserve, or DCR, this meaning Reserve Armored Division, with the reserve not being a description of the units as a second line, but rather of their use as high-value breakthrough divisions to be kept for major offensive or defensive operations. Each DCR would be composed of 2 battalions of B1 Bis grouped in a half brigade. Each battalion would feature 3 companies of 10 tanks, a command tank, and 3 reserve vehicles. There was an additional command tank for the half brigade, with typical complement of B1 Bis in a DCR being 69 or 70 tanks. Within the DCRs, the half brigades of B1 Bis would be accompanied by another half brigade of light tanks, comprising 2 battalions of H-35, H-39 light tanks, with 45 tanks and 12 Lorraine 37Ls per battalion. The division would also include a battalion of chasseurs portés, which acted as mechanized troops for fairly primitive Lorraine VBCP-38L transports and motorized vehicles. A few engineering and transmission companies were also part of the divisions. Overall, the divisions theoretically comprised of only about 6,155 men, a far smaller complement than German panzer divisions that had about 13,000. The German divisions also typically had a far larger complement of tanks, with the average being about 260, and even the less equipped panzer divisions typically had at least 220 tanks at their disposal. Unlike the cavalry's DLMs, which had to be at least theorized for a while, the DCRs were all very young units by the time they were thrown into the fray during the Campaign of France. Only the 1st and 2nd DCRs had their full complement of B1 Bis by May 10, 1940, and both of those divisions had been formed on January 16th of the same year. As the 2 fully operational DCRs, they were included in the Deal Breda maneuver of the French military aimed at securing Belgium and the Netherlands after those were attacked by the Wehrmacht. This would have been done by entering Belgium towards Charleroi, with the 1st DCR going in first and the 2nd DCR going second. Ironically, this inclusion of the 1st and 2nd DCR into the Deal Breda plan would result in disastrous losses of equipment and personnel. The 3rd DCR was younger than the 1st and 2nd, having been formed on March 20th, 1940. By the 10th of May, it was still in its last phases of formation, and its equipment was not complete, with portions of it having been redirected to the 1st and 2nd in order to have them fully operational faster. Including the H-35 and H-39s, 138 tanks were in service by May 10th from an expected total of 160. It appears around 62 B1 Bis were in service in the 3rd DCR's 2 battalions. However, many Lorraine 37Ls were yet to be delivered. The last DCR was the 4th, which vastly differed from the other 3 in terms of composition. It was supposed to begin formation in May of 1940, but due to catastrophic situations on the front, it ended up regrouping not only infantry but also cavalry tank battalions as early as its formation began on May 15th. As early as it was created, the division included the B1 Bis equipped 46th Battalion and the 47th Battalion equipped with the type that was included in the division on 21st of May. Due to availability issues, instead of H-35 and H-39s, the division ended up with 3 R-35 equipped battalions reattached to it. This makeshift nature of the 4th DCR, comprising far more tank units and armored vehicle types than other DCRs, also made it the most numerous in terms of tanks. In theory, it was the only one to be able to go toe-to-toe with the Panzer Division in terms of numbers and personnel and vehicles. Though in practice, not all units would be fully equipped at the same time, as the division was first engaged on the 17th of May. Under the command of Colonel and later Brigadier General Char de Gaulle, a huge proponent of armored vehicles and grouped units, the 4th DCR, even more so than others, would be used as a fireman of the front during the campaign. The 1st DCR was led by Brigadier General Christian Bruno, previously commander of the 511th Régiment des Chars du Combat. This was the first unit to have received the operational B1 all the way back in 1935, and was arguably France's most prestigious tank unit. General Bruno was therefore very much suited to command the first of the French infantry's tank divisions, particularly as the 1st DCR did include elements of the 511th RCC, which was dissolved at the outbreak of the war. The fully outfitted 1st DCR planned to advance into Belgium towards the city of Charleroi. The quick German breakthrough through the Ardennes led to the unit being redirected on May 14th in efforts by the French to try and destroy the bridgehead which had been secured by the Wehrmacht across the river Meuse at Dinnen in Belgium. The 1st DCR and its two B1 Bis battalions, the 28th and the 37th, were engaged basically alone and with minimal infantry support against German troops of two panzer divisions on May 15th. The French situation was, from the start, pretty abysmal. Following the general directions which had been issued to the DCR, most of the logistical and notably refueling elements were all the way at the rear of the division and its convoy, which quickly made the situation disastrous. When the high number of refugees fleeing the German advance on the roads made progressing a difficult affair, large portions of the division and the B1 Bis found themselves out of fuel, utterly incapable of moving. German tanks and troops, supported by their aviation, started advancing on the French positions at around 8:30 a.m. On the front of the 28th Battalion, the most heavily engaged of the division's two B1 Bis battalions, the first German tanks to attack were seen around 8:30. These were vehicles of the 5th Panzer Division, which faced off against the battalion's 3rd Company first. The Germans' vehicles came close to overrunning the battalion in the morning, but were eventually forced back after some considerable losses around 11 a.m. Returning around midnight, forces of the 5th Panzer Division, supplemented by the 7th, were engaged by the battalion until it retreated around 6 p.m. The tanks of the battalion, despite often being immobilized by lack of fuel, fought quite ferociously, and a fair few did claim the destruction of several German vehicles, as well as resisting a large number of hits. B1 Bis No. 283, Tous, allegedly claimed to have knocked out 3 enemy vehicles with the 47mm and 4 with the 75 before being put out of operation. No. 294, Tamatov, claimed 3, while at the same time resisting about 100 hits, including a 75mm high explosive shell to the turret. Those respectable individual successes of some tanks, though likely overestimated to an extent, show the battalion fought bravely, but at the same time it was hopelessly outclassed. During the 15th, it found itself with no support whatsoever from either infantry, artillery, or air, while opposing German tanks were supported by all 3. German vehicles also vastly outnumbered the French. In one instance, a B1 Bis No. 415, Quincy, reported being engaged by about 15 Panzer IIIs and 4s, the crew escaping miraculously despite a broken radiator thanks to a slope which allowed the vehicle to escape for a moment, long enough for the crew to be rescued by another B1 Bis, No. 282, Tunis. By the point the 28th Battalion retreated on the evening of the 15th, only 7 of its B1 Bis were still in its hands, the rest having been knocked out or abandoned due to lack of fuel. Unlike the Germans, which may very well have recovered and repaired knocked out but not irreparably damaged vehicles, there was no hope of ever repairing the lightly damaged tanks that were left back. The 37th Battalion did not fare particularly better. Also engaged from about 8:30 a.m., the battalion was also able to push back German advances with losses in the morning, but was forced to retreat in the afternoon, a move in which its 3 companies found themselves isolated, which turned out disastrous. Under orders of General Bruno, the 2nd Company tried to launch a counterattack towards the south around 1:30 p.m., fearing encirclement. The company faced off against Panzer Regiment 31 of the 5th Panzer Division, supported by anti-tank guns, a fight it was vastly outclassed in, and suffered very heavy losses, with the company's commander, Capitaine Gilbert, killed in action. When orders to retreat came in the afternoon, the battalion's 3rd Company took the wrong path, leading it straight into the front of the German 8th Infantry Division. The following fight resulted in all of the company's surviving tanks being lost and a large number of personnel, including once again the company's leader, Capitaine Lou. Only the 1st Company was able to retreat properly with 7 tanks. In a single day, the 37th Battalion lost 23 B1 Bis and was reduced to the same complement as the 28th Battalion, 7 tanks. The 1st DCR's 2 H-35, H-39 battalions did not fare particularly better. The remaining elements of the division were engaged in the scattered defense of the town of Beaumont on the following day. Both battalions and the remaining 14 B1 Bis, less than half of the battalion's full strength, were basically annihilated in the defense of the town. A few elements, basically 1 B1 Bis and a couple H-39s, continued to fight a fighting retreat on the 17th, but by that point the 1st DCR had basically ceased to exist as an operational unit. General Bruno and his headquarters were captured on the 18th. The 1st DCR was reformed from the ground up on May 31st, with 2 battalions of R-35s and a battalion of B1 Bis. This attempt to recreate an armored division to desperately try and fend off the tide of German forces that had now encircled most of the French army's best elements never reached full strength a DCR may normally have. The unit was engaged from the 8th to the 10th of June in delaying fights along the River Oise to try and allow infantry units on the brink of being overrun to retreat behind French lines and recover. By that point, the unit appears to have been about a dozen B1 Bis, perhaps a few less. 2 were lost on the 9th of June, both due to breakdowns. The rest of the campaign for the makeshift DCR was spent in a fighting retreat all the way to the Loire River and beyond, until armistice put an end to the division's woes. The 2nd DCR was led by Brigadier General Albert Brouchy. The division he commanded was, as the 1st DCR, fully outfitted by the beginning of hostilities in May 1940. Its B1 Bis battalions were the 8th and the 15th BCCs. The division had been kept in reserve at the orders of the French northeastern headquarters. After the beginning of operations on May 10th, the division was quickly put into alert, and were ordered to move north towards Belgium to provide assistance to the troops located in the area. The division's movements towards the north would prove to be fatal. In order to move north, the tracked and wheeled elements of the division were separated. The wheeled elements, which included pretty much all reconnaissance and logistical means of the division, would move by road, while the tracked vehicles would move by rail. The consequence of this decision could be summed as dislocating the large division into a myriad of small units, which did not have the occasion to reform as a large force due to the very quick advance of German armored elements. The German breakthrough at Sedan on the 13th pushed new orders for the division to reform around the forest of Signy from the 14th onward, but this would not prove successful. Various elements of the 2nd DCR would be unloaded at different railway stations and put under the disposition of different infantry commanders in order to attempt to stop the German breakthrough of crossing the Meuse. The 8th BCC's elements were first engaged on May 15th. The battalion's 3 companies were all unloaded at different stations, which highly complicated the coordination. The companies all operated in several small towns on the Oise River in order to defend bridges on the river and prevent German crossings. The 1st and 3rd companies were further fragmented, with several tanks being sent on individual missions to defend locations separated from the main force. This isolation led to very high losses. In the period between the 15th and 18th of May, of all tanks of the 1st company which had been sent on individual missions, 5 vehicles were lost, along with large parts of 2nd and 3rd battalions as well. The French vehicles would typically face much larger and better organized numbers of German vehicles belonging to several armored divisions involved in the push towards the French coast. As for the 15th BCC, it did not fare any better. The 1st and 2nd companies of the battalion were able to operate fairly closely with each other, while the 3rd company was almost completely on its own. On the first day of the contact with the enemy, May 16th, the first 2 companies would lose 6 tanks and be considerably slowed down by poor logistical facilities, resulting in the 2nd company being very delayed, as it had to refuel with only a single hand-operated pump. The 2 companies continued to operate defensively on bridges on other sectors of the Oise River on the 17th and 18th, constantly being flown over by German aircraft. 12 tanks were operational by the 18th, but the first 2 companies ended up divided into 3 elements which operated in various parts of other units, ending with most of the tanks being lost. The 3rd company was first engaged a bit later than the other units, appearing to meet German troops for the first time on May 17th. 2 of its tanks, Mistral and Tunisi, were engaged in an operation to clean up the village of Landrossi on the 17th. In the village, they encountered a large park of German wheeled vehicles, including Sonderkraftfahrzeuge 221s and 222s, liaison vehicles, and according to some French sources, some Panzer I and II light tanks. This led to the 2 French tanks destroying the parked vehicles, of which the numbers vary greatly among the sources, from several dozens up to 200 vehicles. This, one of the various anecdotal but impressive successes achieved by small numbers of B1 Bis during the campaign, does little to change the fact that the 15th BCC disappeared while having little impact. Most of its tanks, including Mistral and Tunisi, were lost on the 18th and 19th of May. In the morning of May 20th, out of the 62 B1 Bis tanks which had been loaded into railway lines just a week before, 43 had been destroyed or lost to the enemy, and of the remaining 19, only 10 were operational. The division's infantry or Hotchkiss light tanks did not fare any better. The division, as a combat force, had been wiped from the map, and attempts to restructure it would not be successful. The division's last elements would be consumed in the harsh fighting retreat that was the rest of the campaign of France. The 3rd DCR was created 2 months after the first two, in March 1940. It was not entirely outfitted by May 1940, though it appears its B1 Bis complement was complete. As the other DCRs, the 3rd started its movement around the May 13th, and as the two others, the situation on the front led to the 3rd DCR being dislocated into small groups of tanks tasked with defending individual locations as early as May 14th. The division's 2 B1 Bis battalions, the 41st and 49th BCC, were engaged in one of the most famous tank battles of the Battle of France, the Battle of Stone, where French and German troops harshly contested the town of Stone with one another. Located on the southern flank of the German push towards the English Channel, Stone was a major location which, if retaken by the French, could allow French troops to threaten German logistical lines and their entire push towards the west. The most intense phase of the battle was from May 15th to May 17th, where it was the 3rd DCR and the 67th Infantry Regiment against the German 10th Panzer Division and the 16th and 24th Infantry Divisions. The village's control would change 17 times during this battle. It is during the Battle of Stone that the most well-known feat of the B1 Bis happened. On May 16th, B1 Bis No. 337 Eru, part of the 1st Company of the 41st BCC, entered the main street of the village, only to find itself facing a column of 13 German tanks, seemingly German Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs, at very close range. Using its dual weapons, the French tank targeted the front vehicle of the column with its 47mm and the rear vehicle with the 75, making maneuvering very complicated for the Germans. The tank then progressed along the column and knocked out all the German tanks within a few minutes. The frontal armor of the B1 Bis proved invulnerable for the German 75 and 37mm shells. Following this action, Eru left the town, knocking out 2 German anti-tank guns, likely 37mm, on the way. 140 non-penetrating impacts were found on the tank after the action, underlining the very good armor protection of the B1 Bis for its time. This action gained some considerable fame to the tank's commander, Captain Pierre Belot, which would later become a politician in the post-war era. The Battle of Stone was often nicknamed the Verdun of 1940, with both German and French forces suffering considerable losses, with 24 tanks destroyed for the German side and about 30 for the French, including not only the B1 Bis but also some Hotchkiss tanks as well. German troops ultimately remained in control of Stone, and the French attempts to sever the Wehrmacht's logistical lines failed. The 3rd DCR had some serious losses, not only during its battle but also during the subsequent retreat, which saw many of its vehicles suffer breakdowns, often leading to them being abandoned. Around June 10th, there were only about 30 B1 Bis left. As the other DCRs, the 3rd fought a long fighting retreat during June, in which it lost a large proportion of its equipment. For example, Belot's B1 Bis, Irre, ended up sabotaged by its own crew on June 13th due to breakdowns in the suspension preventing further movement. The 4th DCR was the black sheep of all of France's DCRs engaged during the 1940 campaign. Unlike the 1st and 2nd, which were completely outfitted, or the 3rd, which at least tried to have its entire complement of B1 Bis, the 4th DCR was only in the process of being formed by the start of the campaign. The unit quickly became a fireman of the front, receiving units that did not at all enter the usual composition of a DCR. As it was first engaged on May 17th, it only had a single B1 Bis battalion, the 46th BCC, with the 2nd Battalion, the 47th, being added on May 21st. The division was commanded by Colonel Charles de Gaulle, previously commander of the 507th RCC before the war, as well as a theorist and proponent of the use of tanks in large, armored formations. His actions as the leader of the 4th DCR would lead him to being promoted to the rank of general on May 25th, a military title he would bear with pride as the future leader of the Free French forces after the fall of France. The 4th DCR's first battle was the Battle of Montcornet on May 17th, in which the division attacked a locality that had been seized by the Germans near the Aisne River. Like Stone was for the 3rd DCR, Montcornet was another significant location for the logistics of German tank divisions moving further west, and attacking that town was an attempt to prevent the continuation of that German push into the sea. Though the French forces managed to push quite considerably at Montcornet, they faced some serious resistance in the form of a large number of anti-tank guns the Germans had set up. In the morning and early afternoon, most of the action was performed by the division's R-35s and D-2s, with the B-1 Bis being unable to engage deep into the action due to fuel problems. In the late afternoon and early evening, the tanks were finally engaged. 2 B1 Bis were knocked out by 88mm flaks, and another 2 by Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. Several suffered breakdowns and could not be recovered. Overall, 24 French tanks were knocked out during the battle, though most of these were R-35s and D-2s. In terms of human losses, the French suffered less, only 14 killed in action, 9 missing, and 6 wounded, in comparison to about 100 German soldier casualties. The material losses were pretty bad though. Despite the 4th DCR being better organized and cohesive than the other divisions, it lacked aerial and infantry support, which made its vehicles very vulnerable to well-prepared anti-tank guns. Though a number of skirmishes would be fought around the Aisne in the following days, the next major battle of the 4th DCR would be Abbeville. The division was engaged from May 28th to May 31st, following a British assault on the previous day. The objective was to manage to link up with a large number of units stuck in the Dunkirk pocket and at least create a safe evacuation route for them. The B1 Bis' assault focused first on the village of Huppy on the 28th of May. The attack saw the 47th BCC's tanks face off against well-prepared German anti-tank guns. French troops managed to seize Huppy, but extending forward, the 47th BCC encountered 2 well-placed German 88s, Caesar and Dora, which destroyed several B1 Bis. The offensive continued on the 29th on the high place of Montcobert, where 2 88mm guns were located. After a 2-hour-long exchange of fire in the morning, both guns were finally knocked out. The B1 Bis continued moving but were not given any form of infantry support, and their poor radios hindered their coordination. 2 new German 88mm, Anton and Bertha, were once again able to stop the French advance. Around noon, several hundreds of German infantrymen charged the heavy tanks to no avail, as the charge ended in a predictable bloodbath. In the afternoon, the French attacked again with 9 B1 Bis, and 5 ended up being knocked out by those 88s. The final B1 Bis offensive, once more consisting of 9 vehicles, was performed in the afternoon of May 30th. Though some German anti-aircraft guns were knocked out, the French tanks were once again lacking any effective infantry support and suffered from poor communications, which made their attacks poorly coordinated. At the end of the day, only 4 of the 9 attacking tanks survived. The division left the front at Abbeville shortly after, leaving its positions to the British 51st Infantry. While the division had been able to remain far more organized than other DCRs to advance several kilometers into German positions and knock out a number of artillery pieces, it failed to achieve the desired result of a decisive breakthrough against the Germans, in no small part to the inability of French infantry and aviation to support their tanks. In the following weeks, de Gaulle was promoted to the Undersecretary of War and National Defense in the French government, leaving the 4th DCR to Colonel Jules de Soule and General de Lafont. After Abbeville, the fate of the 4th DCR remained similar to the 3 other divisions. It fought in a long, desperate retreat towards the south, and managed to remain somewhat more organized and cohesive than the other units at least. Later in the campaign, with the 4 main tank divisions supposed to operate the B1 Bis basically evaporated, a number of newly produced B1 Bis were issued to smaller makeshift independent units which were engaged in desperate attempts to counter the German tide. These were the 347th, that actually only had 3 B1 Bis, the 348th and the 349th Compagnie Autonome des Chars de Combat, formed on May 18th. Another, the 352nd, will be formed on June 9th by taking a piece out of the 4th DCR. The 348th saw most of its 14 B1 Bis knocked out in a last-ditch attempt to support the British on June 4th in Abbeville. Of those 14, only 3 appear to have survived, the rest being knocked out by German anti-tank guns, mines, or breakdowns. The 349th suffered a similar fate with 5 B1 Bis lost on June 4th, several having been lost in skirmishes from before. And the 352nd, formed later, suffered a similar fate to the DCRs, fighting in a retreat until they basically evaporated. A number of B1 Bis were, later in the campaign, part of small sections of 3, 4, or 5 tanks crewed by whoever could be scraped up, once again fighting in desperate attempts to hold back the advancing Germans. On one occasion, one of these units was formed by 3 turretless tanks, numbers 505, 506, and 507. The B1 Bis' performance during the short campaign of France is a complex subject. When seeing the vehicle's combat records, one can hardly claim the B1 Bis was without fault, but no tanks in service at the time, save perhaps for the British Matilda, could have taken as much punishment and dealt as much damage as the B1 Bis Irre did at Stone. The vehicle proved to be, at times, a major headache for German troops, being typically invulnerable to German tank guns. Its firepower was considerable and varied as well. But a tank as complex, vulnerable to breakdown, and thirsty as the B1 Bis could not reasonably be expected to perform well in an army with such poor logistics. The situation in the campaign of France, with French logistical lines being quickly thrown into chaos, meant that more often than not, a mere minor breakdown or fuel shortage would be fatal to the B1 Bis. And while mighty and powerful, the very poor ergonomics of the tank, combined with the almost systematically lacking coordination with infantry and aviation, meant that the B1 Bis were at times very easy targets for German weapons that could dispose of them, occasionally junker Gu-87 Stukas, but much more regularly large caliber artillery pieces like the 88mm but also 105mm field guns. The B1 Bis ended up being no considerable obstacle to the Germans' lightning-fast invasion of France, and while French crews occasionally caused high losses to their adversaries, many of these knocked-out vehicles would later be repaired by the Germans, as well as a number of lightly damaged B1 Bis, and would be pressed into service by the Wehrmacht. It comes as no surprise that the B1 Bis suffered very high losses during the campaign of France. An attempt to count the losses places them at about 128 B1 Bis lost in combat and 139 abandoned or scuttled due to breakdowns or fuel shortages. Only 21 vehicles were known to still be operational at the end of the campaign, and 79 had an unknown fate. At the end of the campaign, the B1 Bis remaining in the French army were stored in a variety of facilities and handed over to the Armistice Commission and the Wehrmacht. This only comprised a pretty small number of tanks, as the vast majority of the fleet were just completely lost during the campaign of France. A significant proportion of these lost tanks, sometimes only lightly impaired, would be repaired and put back into operation by the German occupiers, using, notably, Renault's facilities of Paris-Billancourt. By October 1940, about 161 B1 Bis had been gathered and were operational or in the process of being put back in action. In German nomenclature, the B1 Bis were known as Panzerkampfwagen B2 740F. They were modified with German radios, and often commander cupolas based on those used in the Panzer IIIs and IVs, replacing the original unopenable commander cupola of the B1 Bis. The Wehrmacht used the B1 Bis for a variety of roles and conversions, for example, the 10.5 cm Leichtgefehlte Hauser auf Geschutzwagen B2F self-propelled gun. Most famously, a number of B1 Bis, but also older B1s, were converted into flamethrower tanks, which was done by replacing the hull-mounted 75 with a flamethrower. Their designation was Flammpanzer B2F. At least 60 tanks were converted in such a fashion. 12 of those were employed on the Eastern Front, with others being kept in France and the British Channel Islands. A German unit, Panzer Abteilung 213, operated only Flammpanzers and standard B1 Bis. It comprised 26 unmodified tanks and 10 Flammpanzers. The vehicles were stationed as a garrison in the Channel Islands from May 1942 until the end of the war. German forces operated B1 Bis on a number of fronts, including in the Soviet Union. However, the majority of vehicles remained in France. In total, 125 were still operational in March 1943. During the liberation of France in 1944, most ended up abandoned or back in the hands of the Free French forces. The liberation of France in the summer of 1944 saw German troops forced to leave most of the country in a hurry to fall back to better defensive positions. At this point, most of the captured B1 Bis were left behind or damaged. During the uprising which started the liberation of Paris on August 19, 1944, a B1 Bis was captured by the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur partisans and put back into action against the German garrison of the city. On October 16, 1944, in the newly liberated city of Orleans, a French military regiment was recreated in the form of the 13th Régiment des Dragonnets. This regiment was to be composed of 3 squadrons of 15 tanks, one of which would be equipped with the B1 Bis. The salvaging of most of the tanks had been organized as early as September of 1944, mere weeks after most of France had been liberated during August. The salvaging was assured by André Giraud of Renault, a veteran of the 28th BCC who had operated the type. The salvaging teams would search for abandoned vehicles in Normandy, scrape the place for mines, and tow the tanks back onto trailers to be driven back to Paris. About 40 vehicles in total were recovered. These were taken to the Samoa factories of Saint-Ouen near Paris and disassembled in order to get their parts. 15 operational B1 Bis were refurbished in this fashion and pressed into service with the 13th Régiment des Dragonnets, or the 13th RD. The B1 Bis of the 13th Régiment des Dragonnets were repainted in US olive drab paint. The vehicles were typically given hand-painted markings, particularly early ones. These included most often Allied white stars or Free French crosses of Lorraine. The 13th Régiment des Dragonnets were engaged during operations against German pockets on the French western coast, typically found around U-boat bases. The unit was notably involved in the liberation of the Oloron Island, La Rochelle, and most significantly, the Royan pockets. Though 2 S-35 were knocked out during these operations, no B-1 Bis is known to have been damaged during them. The conclusion of the war in Europe in May 1945 did not mean the B-1 Bis immediately went out of service. The 13th RD, with its original equipment, was employed in the occupation of Germany from May 1945 until April 1946, when it was dissolved. In 1946, perhaps for its dissolution, the regiment appeared to have returned to its founding city of Orleans, and the dissolution of the regiment on April 15, 1946, finally marked the end of the B-1 Bis' service with the French army. 10 B-1 Bis have survived to this day, all being found in either France or Great Britain. It ought to be noted that all vehicles surviving have formerly been in German service and incorporate a number of German modifications, even if they are typically showcased in French camouflage. The British Bovington Tank Museum has one B-1 Bis, formerly number 114 of Panzer Abteilung 213, operating in the Channel Islands. The French Saumur Tank Museum has 3. One, Rhône, is on permanent display with the museum. A second, Rhin, is still in running condition and is often showcased at Saumur and occasionally in Bovington's Tank Fest as well. The third tank was fitted with a demining device and sits in the museum's reserves. Another French museum, the MM Park, possessed 3 B-1 Bis, all in a fairly poor state and awaiting restoration. There's a few B-1 Bis on outdoor display in France as well, one in stone named Tulal, and 2 named Aero and Téméraire at Mourmelou-le-Gros, a major French military base. As we hope this series of video has shown, the B-1 Bis is a very complex piece of historical machinery, one of the most expensive tanks of its era both in terms of financial cost and working hours that were needed to develop and produce it. Its performances could on occasion be exceptional, but more often than not, some of the vehicles, or the French army's flaws, prevented it from fighting to its full potential. Nonetheless, and despite a fairly short production run, the vehicle soldiered all the way to 1946. And that concludes this series of videos on the B-1 Bis. You may find a quantity of other articles, as well as a complete one on the B-1 Bis, on our website. Ratings, comments, and subscriptions would be greatly appreciated. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit. We also have a link to our community Discord server in the description below. If you would like to help us continue and refine our work, also continue donating to our Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to help us enhance and design new articles and features for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.